Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science, if you haven't been here for a while. My name is Ayça Çubukçu. I'm an associate professor in human rights here at the LSE. I also direct the human rights program here in the Department of Sociology. It's a great honor to be facilitating our public discussion of Fire in Every Direction, Dr. Tareq Baconi's memoir, published only a few days ago in the UK, right? February 12th. I'm also delighted to be introducing our speakers tonight, including the author himself, who kindly agreed to join us tonight. Let me admit, I'm very excited and I'm starstruck. So pardon the shaky voice. Now, to recite his official biography, Dr. Tareq Baconi currently serves as the president of the board of Al-Shabaka. While based in Ramallah, he was the former senior analyst for Israel-Palestine and economics of conflict at the International Crisis Group. Tareq Baconi is also the renowned author of Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. His writing has appeared in the London Review of Books and Washington Post, among many other publications, and he's a frequent contributor and commentator in regional and international media. For many of you, he needs no introduction, but I had to do my official duty. Tonight, we're also joined by our own Dr. Mai Taha, who is an assistant professor in human rights at the LSE and the co-author of the forthcoming book, if I may pronounce it for the first time, Anti-Colonial Radios, The Sonic Lives of Internationalism, co-authored with Dr. Sara Salem. She'll be joining me as we speak with Tareq about his extremely moving memoir tonight. Now, Fire in Every Direction takes us from Haifa to Beirut, Amman to London, Sydney to Ramallah, from the depths of the human psyche to the heightened possibilities of liberation, from obsessional infatuation, if I can call it that, with a first love, to the struggle of coming of age and living a queer life, from searching for home to finding it in and through the intergenerational and burning promise of a free Palestine. Tareq reconstructs and interweaves these struggles with such a remarkable courage and self-reflexivity, with such beauty and unmistakable love, that admittedly his memoir left me in tears by the end of his acknowledgements. I still wonder why. When you have a chance to read the book, the publisher, I hope, is making it available soon. You may feel this sense viscerally too, this desire for the book not to end, not now, not yet. For our conversation to begin then, allow me to welcome to the LSE Dr. Tareq Baconi. Just a note on the proceedings. Tareq will first read a bit from the memoir. This event is being recorded, so bear that in mind when you ask your questions after our conversation about the book. Tareq.
Thank you, Ayça. So I think I'm going to read the first few pages of the book. I haven't done that in events of this kind before, so I hope you find them engaging. The yellow box is worn, its corners collapsing. The green and blue paint stripes streaked across its sides have lost their brightness. The cardboard of its body has sagged, crushed under the weight of travel. Amman, London, Sydney, Beirut, Ramallah. Forced to hold more and more content over the years, its bottom threatens to give way. Its handles almost strip as I move the box to my desk here in London. Lifting the lid releases childhood smells, sugary sweetness, and perfumed paper. The inside of the cover has a scribbled note from high school friends who had gifted me the box, wishing me a meaningful graduation, not knowing that it would come to contain an archive I would visit only occasionally, but otherwise keep safely entombed. Shortly after Ramzi's news reached me, the messenger oblivious to how her words landed, I retrieved the box. Dust had settled on its lid. I peer in. On top are Tata's diaries, my maternal grandmother, which I have only recently inherited. I set those aside, not yet ready to turn their pages. I sift through the rest of the content. There are scores of letters, cards received from friends and family, old journals and pads, notes written on torn pieces of paper by classmates who passed them along during class, and paraphernalia, including a pack of decades-old chewing gum, toilet rolls printed with bright red hearts and lips, stickers, Christmas ornaments, and for some reason that is no longer known to me, but which is frightfully prescient, surgical masks. I pull up Ramzi's side of our correspondence. This stack, disentangled from the box and organized beside my laptop, includes a picture in an unaddressed white envelope. Two barely recognizable teenagers are perched on a ledge. Their backpacks and sweaters are in a heap next to them. The two boys are on the final landing of the 3 set of stairs leading from the classrooms to the main playground. The one on the right, I know, was posing not for the picture, but for 2 other students coming down the stairs. The blue railings snaking alongside the stairs are, I recall vividly, behind the photographer, whose identity I have forgotten. The basketball courts and football pitches are filled with screaming children on the other side of the landing. Looking at the boy on the left, I remember how dry his skin felt in that morning sun, how the medication he had been taking for his acne made him dehydrated and itchy. Even though these kids' most guarded thoughts are still a part of me, there is a vast distance between us, a whole life lived. I kept Ramzi's notes from the very beginning, not just his, everyone's, before I realized that I was keeping everyone's to avoid acknowledging that I wanted to keep only his. Everything he had given me, even before our correspondence had evolved into what it would become. Proper letters, pages long, stapled and enveloped. Those were all in the yellow box, alongside a smaller box that contains 2 cigarettes and a bullet. The blue ink on the cigarettes is still legible. One reads, 20 January 2000, time 3:45. Rules, smoking is a pleasure, and there is no way out of this country except through loving someone. Enjoy. The second, fuck Davidoff and Marlboro. This cigarette is from my last packet. It was not. On my 17th birthday, a month later, there was another cigarette stuffed into the card I received. I slipped the card out of the envelope and opened it. The cigarette is almost flattened in the crease, but the writing on it remains clear and crisp. Happy birthday, TB. It's really nice to have you by my side. Love you, but not a lot. The bullet, if I remember correctly, is from a camping trip he had gone on with his father to North Jordan. I had refused to join, much to his frustration. You want me to spend a whole day just with him? It'll be lecture after lecture. His complaints resonate in my mind. I sift through his other gifts, chocolates, candy, photographs, cards, and skillfully drawn vulgar pornographic sketches, 3-dicked aliens and multi-boobed creatures in twisted sexual positions. In front of me is a trail, his side of the letters we wrote to each other as we fell in love. We wrote on anything we could find, yellow legal notepads or blank A4 sheets, pages torn out of notebooks or the backs of cigarette packets, whatever scraps were lying around our homes. We left them on each other's beds or in our backpacks whenever we couldn't meet for whatever reason, and our conversations had to find other ways to meander. I am reminded that his letters were neat. The lines never sloped, even on unlined paper. His handwriting was tight and cursive, lines of English interspersed with a strange hybrid of Arabic, colloquial words written with the full diacritics of formal Arabic. At the bottom of the pile is the first note I got from him. It is little more than a hasty scroll that I can barely decipher on the torn corner of what looks like a textbook. Geography maybe, or history, laminated paper that has browned with time. Sometimes I would leave his place, walk back to mine, only to find a letter stuffed into my backpack. Those were the most precious. Letters that held thoughts that bordered on confessions, ones that grew beyond the confines of any one exchange, and instead contained words that could not be spoken, text that he was depositing in my safekeeping, words that were directed at me but were not necessarily for me, that made me a container for his musings, a human journal, made me also his witness. Some letters were full of recrimination, calling me out or raging at my behavior from behind a safe distance of a delivered screed. He was nocturnal, I wasn't, and when he couldn't call me late at night, he would write, "Imagine a chat we might have had if I were awake, embody my response, find himself against my words, and then leave me that record." I treasured his written trust then, and today I am grateful for it. In front of me is a transcript of his earlier self, one he has most likely forgotten or discarded, an archived monologue waiting to be excavated. My voice is absent, not yet reclaimed, not yet molded into the voice of the man I am today. With my side of that correspondence missing, and with very little recollection of what I might have written him more than 2 decades ago, his letters help me retrace my past, make sense of my present, starting in Amman.
So we would like to begin by asking you, what made you decide to write a memoir, seemingly a genre that is worlds apart from your earlier work on Hamas, your political commentary, your scholarly research? Who were the writers? Edouard Louis comes to mind. We had a little chat about him before. So when did it first occur to you to write this memoir?
So I never wanted to write a memoir. I never thought of myself as a memoirist. I mean, you know me personally, and I'm quite a private person. So writing a memoir was a nightmare, or the idea of writing a memoir was just not something that I would have ever entertained seriously. But I always knew that I wanted to write the story of Ramzi and my relationship growing up in Amman. When the relationship was beginning, and as I was finding myself and losing myself in that relationship, I really struggled to describe to myself and to him what was happening. And I knew that it was unfinished in my mind, that there was something that I would come back to once I understood myself, and once I had the language to explain what it was that I couldn't explain then. So it was always like a shadow in the back of my mind that this was something that I would go back to. And it took me 2 decades to sort of feel that I had enough distance between that, those few years in this book and now to sort of be able to come back to it. So it took me some time, and I wanted to write that story, and I started writing that as soon as I finished my first book. And then invariably, as I started writing about that relationship, the book, it's like scope creep. The book started growing, the 2 boys are in Amman. They're Palestinian. Why are they in Amman? What about their family homes are different because they're Palestinian? And questions started coming up, explaining my childhood. I was raised in many ways by my maternal grandmother. And so bringing her into the story of this relationship and my childhood raised questions. She's a refugee from Haifa. What are the silences that we lived in? How did that grief and pain shape my childhood? So very quickly, it became a story that was bigger than those 2 boys. And I found myself moving in the genre of memoir. Now looking back, I actually don't think it's that surprising for 2 reasons. One is because I love the genre. I love reading memoir. People like Edouard Louis are a huge inspiration. Kiese Lemon, Carmen Maria Machado. There's a huge genre of memoir written by queer folks, but also specifically in the US by African Americans or marginalized communities. So that genre was one that was very evocative for me. And the second reason is now sort of looking back is understanding actually how prevalent memoir is in Palestine and sort of this world, Edward Said, obviously his famous memoir, but other memoirs, written by a whole array of Palestinians, I think in many ways embodies the Palestinian commitment to resistance, to maintaining our oral traditions in a world that's constantly gaslighting and that's stealing our archives, hiding our stories. There's something about memoir that is critical for Palestine, for sort of holding onto our narrative, despite all the other narratives telling us that our narratives is lesser than, or despite the sort of the sense that we need validation by others, by Westerners, by Israelis to sort of talk about our own history. And so I think memoir is a very solid tradition in Palestine, and I think I didn't realize that I was putting myself in conversation with that body.
Thank you, Mai.
So thank you so much, Tareq, for such a beautiful, beautifully written book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The book, as kind of Ayça and you also spoke, is able to very smoothly weave in your innermost feelings, even though you hold back, along with the history of the Palestinian struggle of displacement and dispossession. But I told you this before, that for me, one of the really amazing things about the book is that it kind of read like a novel, like a non-linear narrative structure that kind of takes the reader in across different time and space, different cities. And so I want to frame my comments today to honor that literary form as much as possible. And perhaps one way to do that is to think about the memoir from the perspective of the characters, like in a novel, and the cities. So I'll divide my comments with some of the people and some of the cities, not all. And I think I want to start precisely with what you just were speaking about, through the characters of Tata and Rima. So Tata is Tareq's grandmother, and Rima is Tareq's mother. So let me just go to the text here, because I have quite a bit from your own writing, which is so beautiful. So while the book is framed largely as a love story between two boys, I read it to be also very much about the mother figures in your life, as you were just saying. The characters that hold all the rage of years of dispossession and displacement. When your grandmother speaks about being forced to leave Haifa during the Nakba, her memory of anger was not focused on the fact that she's leaving her home. She remembers that her mother pulls her strongly with force. And you say, remembering this gesture as if it was more offensive than the loss of her home, as you had put it. Something about this mundane memory amidst the spectacle of violence of the Nakba, I think, means something to you. This constant movement between the rage of your grandmother and her mundane day-to-day life captures something. She would later also casually mention to you, we left Lebanon between Tal al-Zatar and Sabra and Shatila, and as you say, a time etched in massacres. So casually in conversation, yet she's speaking about very violent incidents. She would also mock you for asking how she visited her friend regularly during the war in Lebanon for tea, and then she would say, "Well, Tareq, do you think I would stay 15 years without having tea?" And then she recalls in that same incident sipping the tea with her friend, and then a sound interrupts their conversation, which is a missile, and then she starts laughing about the sipping the tea with the missile. So can you perhaps, say more about capturing this constant tension between the mundane and the spectacular in her life, which I think captures to a large extent also the Palestinian experience. And a similar tension we also see in Rima, your mother's character, who at times I felt that the book was really about her more than anything else. So when Rima's best friend is massacred in Tal al-Zatar refugee camp in Lebanon, you write that, quote, she was neither inconsolable nor desperate. She was simply changed, close quote. So this tragedy, this rage, would quickly metamorphose into practical action. So she sends a note to her partner at the time, who would later become her husband, Fadi, come to Amman. And then you write, how quickly a life can be packed up. How quickly the spectacle of violence turns into the mundane practicality of packing. But for Rima, the tension goes beyond that. Rima has fire in her heart. Despite the civil war, her life in Beirut ignited that fire further and further, a fire that would soon move to the back burner as she moves to Amman and marries Fedi. In Amman, she becomes a housewife. Rima, bring me the salt. Rima, do this. Rima, do that. Rima, etc. But as you say at some point, rage has become part of her being. It ebbs and flows. Tareq, Rima's son, would later write, our struggle too is hereditary. Mama has taught me that. She has simply passed on the baton, the one she has been given from Tata, who had received it from her mother. Tareq asks the crucial question, what future would Mom have had if her survival was not made contingent on acquiescence? But Tareq leaves us with one of the most beautiful moments of the book. On bus 19 in London, just as it passed Green Park, Tareq finally tells his mother yes. And he recalls, quote, when we got off the bus, she hugged me. She would teach me how to rage with dignity, I thought, how to rage without burning myself and others down. So, what are your thoughts on this rage, on those tensions in the life of both your grandmother and your mother, and on the rage that is all over the book that you have clearly inherited with such coolness as well, you know, like rage with coolness is bizarre, you know.
Wow. That's a beautiful question. Thank you. I mean, I have a few things to say. So on the issue of domesticity, I think it's, you know, I think at least for me, maybe not everyone has the same story, but for me, it's almost like Palestine came into my life and into my psyche implicitly, not explicitly. You know, my parents and my grandparents talked about Palestine, they talked about the Nakba, they talked about the civil war in Lebanon without ever giving the political context. They talked about their domestic experiences, how, you know, my grandmother's father, my grandmother's mother pulling her to run away during the Nakba. She talked about that sort of being pulled out of her home. And I understood that feeling before I understood that the Zionists were expelling Palestinians out. And so it was almost like the mundaneness of life is what got transmitted down to me before I understood the political context. And in some ways, I think that's beautiful because it grounds and roots the core of what's felt, this sort of visceral experience of expulsion and then civil war that's in my body, that's transmitted down into me. But I for a period of time, it also left me a bit lost because I couldn't quite understand. I felt like I didn't really understand my political history. You know, I had to do that. I had to turn to books. I had to turn to the academy. I had to turn to activists. I had to ask questions to make sense of what it was that I was feeling. So there was a bit of a mismatch, and it's not helped by the fact that our governments, you know, are authoritarian in ways that means that our education is policed. So we don't understand. Growing up in Amman, I mean, some people here might find that surprising. We don't learn our history. We don't learn our politics. And so there's a gap between this sort of the lived experience in our homes, the pain, the grief, the confusion, the disorientation, and the narratives that we're told and the ways that we were sort of living. And so I think there's something about this domestic space for me that was actually my entry point into Palestine. And the two women, I didn't think about that. It wasn't sort of conceived in that way. This book really was trying to follow the feelings that had nested in me. But again, inevitably, it would be my mother and my grandmother because they really were the figures who kept Palestine alive across the generations and embedded in me a sense of injustice and a commitment to struggle. But the ways that they dealt with Palestine were very different. I mean, my grandmother was a woman of faith. She was a Christian woman, and she understood Palestine and her expulsion from Palestine as a divine act. You know, as she would say, God works in mysterious ways. She couldn't understand what the loss of Palestine meant, but for her, there had to be a reason that was bigger than her, a reason that you couldn't possibly understand. My mother did not. I mean, my mother is a woman of faith, but she had no patience for that. For her, it was clear who the perpetrators were, what needed to happen. You know, she was ready to go. She was ready to go into the struggle, and was actually hemmed in by forces that were bigger than her, and ultimately by the patriarchy, and by sort of the domestication that she experienced in Amman, and that resulted in a lot of rage. She was subdued. You know, in some ways, her wings were clipped in a way that meant that she was constantly burning up. You know, she was constantly rebelling, and that's the energy I remember. I couldn't understand where this rage came from, but I could understand the rage. You know, I felt my mother's rage when I was a toddler. It just animated the environment that I was in, and so it took me a minute to understand that rage and to place it within its sociopolitical context, to understand how it shaped my political views, but before that, how it shaped me emotionally. And I think in some ways, that's the work of excavation. In some ways, I wanted to excavate the sort of these emotional sediments that I could maybe articulate. You know, I could talk to you today analytically about Palestine, but to understand how it's sort of in my body, how it's felt, how it's shaped our home, the relationships we have, the love that we have for each other. That for me was what this memoir allowed me to do, because I was placing Ramzy and I in those environments, and I was trying to understand them in that way. So it was a very domestic way of coming into it. Yeah.
When Maya and I were chatting before, you know, preparing for this conversation, we discovered we both thought Rima is the main character.
You know, she would agree with me. Everyone who meets her in Jordan, she keeps saying, you know, this book is about me.
So, you know, the image of your mother, your beautiful relationship with Tata, your grandmother, but really it's your mother, it seems, that is the carrier of the fire that is in the title of the book. I kept, you know, turning the title of your memoir around in my head. Why did he name it Fire in Every Direction? What does it mean, fire in every direction? And the passage I read about rage without burning oneself and others struck me as well. But I wonder if the title of the book, Fire in Every Direction, is it also not an injunction? Can it be, what if there was an exclamation mark after fire in every direction? So I kept literally turning the title around in my head, and I want to move from the textual to the macro. Why did you call your memoir Fire in Every Direction?
So I think rage is central to this book. I also think rage is central to me. And I think that rage is often misunderstood. You know, it's seen as something that should be quieted down or controlled or disciplined. In many ways, yes, to live lives that are purposeful and meaningful. In other ways, I think rage is underestimated. And I think that rage is political. And it's absolutely necessary in the face of injustice and in the face of the world that we're living in today. So there's something, and I think particularly this is something that's obviously not only to Palestinians and Palestinian women. Obviously, other marginalized women, Black women specifically, feel the discrimination of rage. You know, they're seen as irrational and they're seen as uncivilized and hasty. And so I think there's something that I'm guilty of seeing my mom's rage as irrational, and being angry at her for being irrational, for being angry, and it took me a while to understand that rage and to treasure it and to come to see it as something that, the piece you read about it being hereditary. There's something about it being passed on that's very powerful. This fire is precious because it reflects a refusal to acquiesce, and it reflects a desire for something more and a commitment to something more. It's sort of what keeps one burning. And so I think that this thinking of rage as a political phenomenon, thinking about it as something that is fundamental to Palestine, to Palestinians, but not only, I think is something that's central to this book. And so in the title, I think my mom encapsulates that rage, but there is something about that rage sort of being spewed in different directions that is also a reflection on our time, where we're living in a burning world, literally, not just figuratively, and so there's calamity in every direction, and I think that there's something about that undisciplined nature of what's happening that's also reflected in how we respond to it and what kind of rage we bring to it, how we respond to it with rage. So there's something that's political for me. It's not just a meditation on her rage, but a sort of a call to arms in a way. Yeah.
That's what I was wondering, whether it is, in fact. May, would you like to cut?
Okay, so the other characters I wanted to ask you about are the character of Tareq and the character of Ramzi, which is presented as, about these two characters. So we see when everyone reads the book, hopefully soon, you'll see that Tareq is infatuated by Ramzi, a friend from a long time. And Ramzi has this aura, something that Tareq is constantly thinking about, how to be around a person like this, or how to share life, a friendship, a love together. But the book, on some level, it's a very brave story as a memoir, right? Specifically given the context. But the book is able to write about a queer Arab boy without it being a queer Arab story. And I think this is important for several reasons. Obviously, there is a nuance in speaking about sexuality and speaking about gender more broadly when we're talking about the Arab world, or even like the Global South more generally in relation to the North. And I think there is something about the way it's written that neither romanticizes, where you are now physically, nor romanticizes where you're from, a return to a place that is, welcoming, and if only you just, use different words, you would be fine, and all of that. So there's an acknowledgement of the beauty and the utter ugliness of what it means to be queer in the Arab world. And I think this becomes particularly important when we're thinking about language and the fact that this memoir was written in English. And I see, I guess my question has to do with the audience and language. The character Tareq at some point is also bothered by this question. So first of all, he mocks himself. He says, "I was an Arab who was closer to the colonial power than to those sorry folks who had been colonized. A cosmopolitan, a citizen of this world, diversity, tolerance. I now have gay friends." And then you're clearly mocking the surface level of analysis. But at the same time, there is still a nagging question of what does it mean to write this book in English for a particular audience. But you're also troubled by the question of language. You say, I write in a language that is not my own, a foreign tongue that has become a reliable one, without yet dispelling its foreignness. In taking it on, I failed to scrub this adopted language of its foreignness. Yet reclaiming my Arabic is a fraught endeavor, like visiting the site of an unpleasant memory. I remain bereft, at home, neither here nor there. So there's something about this perpetual foreignness, this double consciousness that you actually mentioned, this alienation that encapsulates also the life of a refugee.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your thoughts on this, on language, audience, alienation?
How long do you have? I have a lot of thoughts on this. I mean, so I think, so just on the issue of language, I'll start with language. I do think that there's something around language that, or at least my sense of estrangement from Amman, you know, in a very adolescent estrangement, you know, me recognizing that I'm queer and recognizing that there's no space for me here and sort of angrily leaving and coming to London, a sort of a sense of estrangement from Amman that in many ways is linguistic, that, you know, everything about this place doesn't welcome me, therefore I don't want anything to do with it. And, you know, so I go in very material ways. I go from, you know, being a voracious reader of Arabic literature to reading English. And even to Ramzi before that, you know, he would say these loaded things like, oh, you don't belong here, you're too good for this place, which now I understand where all that was coming from. But in many ways, it created distance between me and Arabic. And, you know, I was bullied in Arabic. The language, the pejorative terms that I faced were in Arabic. So there was a sense of wanting distance from that. So I do reflect on it in the book, this sense of estrangement and exile being linguistic. And also in Jordan, like in other formerly colonized places, speaking in the language of the colonized is also on the colonizer is aspirational. This is how you sort of evoke status and evoke, you know, your quest to being elite. And so there's all of these things that are tied together in the terrain of language. That makes it the space where some of these feelings of exile, estrangement, belonging sort of play out. And so it took me a minute to understand that and to, you know, I think now being in a very conscious place of wanting to reclaim writing in Arabic as a political act, as an act of colonization and of decolonization and reclamation and resistance. But there's a genealogy, there's a history of all of that. And I think I try in the book to own some of that sense of alienation in Arabic. Now, when I was writing, I was viscerally aware of the fact that I was writing in English. And I didn't want to, and I might have failed or succeeded, I don't know, but my intention was not to write to the Western audience. I wanted to write to Ramzi. That was the spirit of the book. I wanted to tell him what I couldn't tell him 2 decades ago. And so the way I tried to manage that tension was by crafting the book as a letter. So the earliest draft of this book is a letter addressed to Ramzi, which meant that if he's my reader and he's my audience, I don't have to explain to him anything that I wouldn't need to explain to another Palestinian man. So I don't need to explain the Nakba. I just say Nakba. I don't need, you know, the tiniest details of a lived Palestinian life go unexplained. And I introduce Arabic into the text without translating the Arabic. So if you're not an Arabic reader, you will be unsettled by that. And I wanted that. I wanted the non-Arabic reader to be unsettled because for me, the gaze was another Arab man's eyes. And so technically and structurally, I tried to sort of deal with that a little bit. And then, you know, there's this question of specifically around queerness and what does it mean to write, not only to write a queer Arab story, but also to claim the title of queer as an Arab man is a fraught debate. You know, we're familiar with Joseph Massad's work on Desiring Arabs, sort of thinking about what it means to claim these identities of the LGBTQ plus in the context where the Gay International, this language of the international human rights organizations weaponize these terms. What does it mean for a queer Arab to say in English they're queer, without falling into the trap of saying, oh, therefore I'm judging my homophobic society and I want this foreign liberal agenda to be implemented here? That actually rather I identify as queer and say my politics are indigenous. They're still anti-imperialist. They're still anti-Zionist. I'm rejecting all of that Western liberal discourse, but I also am a queer person. I have same-sex relations, and it's not that I want to have those relations invisibly. I want to own the fact that I have those relations because it gives me comfort and security and maybe eventually rights. But it's very difficult. The flip to that would be the argument that says you can have same-sex relations, owning it publicly goes against our culture, and that's not necessarily, the politics of visibility and invisibility, and that's all a foreign agenda. And so, I defer a lot to indigenous queer movements, how they try to grapple with this, organizations like Al-Qaws, which in Palestine, which centers queer politics within a decolonial framing that tries to sort of deal with some of these tensions. But I have to say, I don't know that these things are resolved in me. I think there's something that continues to be unsettled. I think the visibility of coming out of the memoir saying, I'm a queer Arab, this is my story, that sits uncomfortably with me. But then the text itself, I try to, I don't say, I don't proclaim my queerness in this way in the text. I try to be more loyal to the lived experience of how I would talk about this, let's say in Amman. But there is that sort of tension between here and there that I think is a life of an exile that means you're constantly living in the margins. And I also think that's what queerness is. I think queerness is an identity of being in the margins. And so I think it's sort of how do you hold all of these tensions in the container of the book, but in the container of the body as well. And I don't know that I have good answers to that. It's sort of recognizing these tensions. Yeah.
What you just said reminded me of chapter 21, which I wanted to read. Perhaps it's the briefest chapter, if I may, or
yeah, no, please. I would love to hear you read it.
Okay. Chapter 21. It is hard to figure out exactly where envy ends and infatuation begins. Almost immediately, that afternoon, Ramsey waltzed into my basement. I became consumed by his presence, his way of being, his wit and confidence, the absence of doubt in his head, his ability to command rooms and people. Those features became the blueprint for my own happiness. If only I could become him, someone who was better and manlier and handsomer and stronger. Who he was defined who I needed to be to belong in our white city. And I wanted, more than anything, to belong. I looked at him with insatiable envy, not the ill-wishing kind, but the one full of hunger and desperation. I wanted what he had, because what he had was good and recognized and affirmed. What I had, what I was, needed to be erased. Yet the more like him I tried to be, the more of myself I relinquished. Amman embraced him as it pummeled me. It reminded me of what was objectively true. He was the boy I could never be, or as we grew older, be with. This gives a bit of a sense of, there is queerness and the struggle with being queer, although you never quite say that in the text. But also there's the struggle, perhaps intersecting struggle with masculinity. There is the father in the book as well, let's not forget. There is that struggle with manliness that intersects, I think, with language as well as class. And I want to bring the question of class, sexuality, and masculinity together, if I may, because this is a memoir not only brave for its, risking being the native informant, yet in Masadian sense, but never going there. Very successful, I think, in not doing that. But it's also brave in highlighting all kinds of differences within the Palestinian diaspora and the Palestinian struggle for liberation, including class differences, which are written all over the memoir. You're not erasing the consequences of coming from a particular class background in your personal/political struggles in Amman or elsewhere. Could we speak a little bit about that?
Yeah.
How you were conscious of class, and it's so rare in my experience to be speaking about those.
Yes.
In relation to Palestinian life.
I mean, I think both class and masculinity and the way they intersect is hugely important for me. I think that, so first on masculinity, I think that this book is very much a feminist book, and that wasn't my intention. Yes. I'm happy with the result, but it wasn't my intention. And I'm curious about why that is the case, and what is it about my father, who was also a formative figure in my life, that I couldn't quite interrogate. And there is something for me that is about an aversion of and a rejection of masculinity, and this sort of this sense that this is how men need to be. That obviously, this passage that you read, that obviously I couldn't be. That meant that there was a certain kind of repulsion to the sort of the domineering claim that this is how a man should be. This is sort of not domineering, this sort of almost totalitarian claim. Like, if you can't be this kind of man, then there's something wrong. And so there's something for me about masculinity, my aversion to it, the way that I want to interrogate it more. I don't think I do enough of that in the book. And I think maybe, once I finished this book, I shared it with a memoirist, and he said, now that you've started writing a memoir, there's no turning back. You'll find other issues you need to think about. And at first I dismissed it. And now I'm thinking, I really would love to interrogate my relationship with my father a bit more. And this relationship with masculinity, that's a very uneasy relationship for me. So there's that. Now, on the issue of class, and the two are not obviously mutually exclusive, I was very conscious of the fact that, even the language discussion, it's a class discussion as well. It's not, and I traced that through the history of my family. So as I said, my family is Christian. And when they get expelled from Palestine, they land in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, between 48 and 51, the Lebanese government used to naturalize Christian refugees, but not Muslim refugees, because they were playing with the demographics of the country. And so you have refugees then coming into the status and the security. They're able to get homes. They're able to find jobs. That lands them in a completely different reality than Muslim refugees. There's no precariousness necessarily in the same way. Obviously, not all Christian refugees. Some did end up in camps, especially after a few years after the Nakba. But there was this privilege that was given to Christian refugees, which meant that we existed in a different class. And by the time we landed in Jordan, we were lower middle class. So we were certainly not comfortable as a family. My parents, that's why my maternal grandmother had such a huge role in raising us. Both of my parents were working long hours, but there was some comfort. There was some access to security, which other refugees don't have. And then through my father's work, we moved very comfortably into middle class. And so I was very aware of that class transformation over the course of my life. And I'm very aware of what this means in terms of access, in terms of even being able to think about this. And these are not in the book, but I have very vivid memories of my grandmother who stayed in Lebanon. So my maternal grandmother, she stayed in Lebanon throughout the Civil War. She never left. And when I started working on Palestine academically, and I started going back, I spent time in refugee camps in Lebanon, interviewing Palestinians there. She would be very dismissive. She would say, "What are you doing going to the camps? They're dirty." And she's a refugee. She's a refugee who became a Lebanese citizen who has now comfort and the comfort of middle class, would look at refugees who are still in camps in a sort of in that kind of a distancing way. And you see that, by the way, in Ramallah, you see that in the West Bank and sort of the class divide between the urban elites and the refugee camps. So I think those politics are very much present, and they animate how we think about Palestine, and specifically in the case of the themes that what I'm writing about in terms of masculinity. Then masculinity gets defined by all of these distorted ways. So, for example, Ramzi is a straight banker in the Gulf. You know, the essence of manlyhood. You know, he's sort of a father with children, rich, and so masculinity gets distorted in all of these different in all of these different ways. Obviously, that's not the only. If you look at another class, you would think of masculinity in terms of resistance, in terms of arms, in terms of how But there's all these ways in which masculinity, the patriarchy, class, all of these things intersect in very interesting ways.
Thank you.
So
I love this, by the way.
But basically, the last set of questions, as I said at the beginning, have to do with the cities. Because I feel like, at least the first part felt so much like, is this about Beirut? Is it about Amman? And then we moved to other cities. I'm not going to ask you about all of the cities, but I'll ask you about Amman, about Haifa, and about Gaza. Because we start with Amman, and then you give us a sense of the kind of enclosed, almost claustrophobic sense of living in Amman, especially as juxtaposed to kind of a more romanticized life of your parents when they were back in Beirut, despite the extreme violence. But we also see Amman changing with the neoliberalization of the city. You mentioned all of the food chains. I recall from my own childhood as well, like when McDonald's opened, it was such a huge, like the streets were like packed and everyone wanting to have that burger. And you described something similar in Amman. But you also describe it as also slowly opening up with the Books Cafe that is kind of under the table, known to be gay friendly, etc. But also Amman is like a nexus of going into and going out of Palestine. It's next door, but it's also subdued, silenced, blinded by its own, obviously, authoritarian system that is very much, part of the whole imperial project. When you go to Haifa, it's a very different story. So in Haifa, you're returning to your grandmother's home, a story that we hear of many Palestinians wanting to go back to see, to witness the place of original displacement. And I'll read just very quickly, because it's just so beautifully written. You return, first of all, you return with your partner as the kind of fully grown person that you now are, a comfortable queer man, I guess, and you're returning to your grandmother's house in Haifa. You say, I want to imagine it empty, loyal, waiting for our return. I want it to exist outside of time, as if everything stopped that April. I have finally bent time, held her history in my present. So Haifa, the pretty city on the Mediterranean Sea that we hear all sorts of beautiful descriptions, is taken over by settlers in 1948 and is now part of Israel, or the 1948 territories. And this is where you return. Finally, we move to Gaza, and something else is happening. So you move from the pretty city of the Mediterranean, Haifa, to Gaza, and you say the following. In Gaza, there are no polished facades. No corner of your past is left untouched by the settlers' cruelty, their arrogance and fear. It is all on full display here. One lives the truth of what humanity has done, is doing, and in that honesty, There is pain, but also freedom. I fall in love and begin to understand that this tiny sliver of land holds the secrets to our world. It is precisely Gaza's abjection that makes it the site of revolution, a land teeming with life and love, a territory with the power to shake our world out of its stupor. I'm not romanticizing the misery of Gaza, far from it. What I'm trying to convey is that in the most abject of spaces, the queerest of selves, beauty abounds. So beautifully put. But like the final question I want to ask you is, what are your thoughts on writing those cities into your story? And what does it mean to reread this after more than 2 years of genocide in Gaza? Because my sense is also you have written the whole book before the beginning of the genocide, but you clearly have a particular relationship with the place.
It's funny. I'd never thought about that progression until you mapped it out in this way, and I think it's powerful to think about the way in which going from Amman to Haifa to Gaza was also going to closer and closer to a truth of what Palestine is. So I think that, so a couple of things about Amman. Amman, I think, is underrepresented in terms of in the literary world, certainly in English. And I was very aware of that when I was writing through Amman, that you know, when you're talking about I don't know, London or New York, there are certain things that you don't have to say. The references are clear, and Amman, they're not. But again, talking to Ramzi meant that I don't need to explain much about what Amman is to, let's say, a Western reader. And for me, the thing that I was most intrigued by in Amman was its silence. And again, this is a class thing, by the way, because if you're in refugee camps in Amman, then things are not silent and you're political. But if you're in the middle class in Amman, if you're living in the city, the sort of the neighborhoods, the sort of the main neighborhoods in the city, the likelihood is you're surrounded by Palestinians who are now identifying as Jordanian. And B is that you're pretty much apolitical. You don't deal with anything that's outside of the neoliberal project. You're sort of focused on consumption. You're focused on the quality of life. You know, you have your latest fashion trends, and this is suffocating. And especially back to your point about domesticity and politics at the beginning, this is why the domestic spaces in some ways become shorn of their politics. It becomes sanitized. So there's something in Amman that I found oppressive, that I continue to find oppressive in those spaces, that they're not political, they're not true to the politics of the people living in those cities. And then you end up in thinking about Beirut becomes romanticized as this place where the politics is so, volatile and ever present that it's not even it can't be contained. It constantly sort of throws the city into rounds of violence. But anyway, so that's the juxtaposition in my mind between Amman and Beirut. Haifa was something else completely, because it was, for me, unreachable. I couldn't go to Haifa until I naturalized as a UK citizen. And when I went, it was after years of studying the place and of understanding the politics of it very academically and intellectually, cerebrally, and then landing in Palestine and seeing how much Haifa evoked Beirut for me, how much it evoked Amman, the understanding that I grew up in this space, that I had never been to. Sort of, obviously, all of the Zionist mappings and trappings are there, but underneath is Palestine. It's it's Palestinian. So, it's sort of being able to touch that, to go to my grandmother's house, being able to reclaim that was really something that was very powerful for me emotionally. It felt like an act of return that I was and continue to be committed to, despite the political realities of preventing actual return to sort of live there and reclaim our house and so on. And then Gaza is its own, it's its own reality, in the sense that I started studying Gaza. My academic research was on Gaza almost coincidentally. When I wanted to start understanding Palestine more deeply, I started this work in 2005, 2006. Political things were happening. Hamas was getting elected. This was the end of the second Intifada, and there was this civil strife that was being fomented by the Americans and the Israelis between Palestine. I was interested in the questions of the contemporary politics that was happening. That's what drew me into Gaza. It wasn't anything more than that. And now I'm so grateful for that, because Gaza has become, for me, really the heart of understanding not just Palestinian politics, but the politics of our lives in this world that we're living. The devastation of the genocide, the way that Gaza has become the epicenter of global politics, for me makes sense, because it is the epicenter of global politics. The fact that we can live 2 years of a live stream genocide with no power moving to stop it shows how fucked up, or how colonized our world is. In sort of, despite all of its declared sort of liberalism and universality, and sort of so it's sort of removed the facade of all of this. And so I was really interested in Gaza as this place where two things are happening. One, it's completely being misunderstood and sort of written about in these horrifying terms as a site of misery, as a dark place, a place where only terrorists live. It's sort of reduced into these most deplorable terms, in sort of, especially in terms of the Western media, but not only, generally. And then this place that you visit where you understand the structural realities of dispossession and of colonization and of resistance and of revolution, and how these two things, it sort of becomes the case that you understand how abjection serves power. And so I started thinking about, well, what happens when this abjection becomes a site of revolution? And that for me is also queerness again. And so Gaza, I don't know, I didn't spend enough time in Gaza. They controlled the amount of time I could go in, but it lodged itself very firmly in my sort of intellectual life, but very much in my emotional life as well. And the past 2 years have been devastating, as they have been for many people. And I have been deeply uncomfortable and unsettled about publishing this book at this moment, because of that, and because of feeling that there's any kind of life continuing right now in a moment of genocide is obscene. It's obscene. And so there was something about this book being written now and coming out and launching it and talking, I could argue to myself, this is a book about the Nakba. The genocide is the continuation of the Nakba. This is as Palestinian, I could do all of these things, but the reality is that anything now that continues life as we've known it in a moment of genocide is just deeply uncomfortable. There's no two ways around that. And I own that. And they just sort of accept that there's been a deep failure by Palestinians, by the world, at letting this genocide go the way it did without heed. Yeah.
Shall we conclude that before I turn to the audience, first and last, we're very glad you put this book out there, extremely grateful. And perhaps to appropriate Tata's saying, revolution works in mysterious ways. So thank you very much, Tareq. Oh, we have about 25 minutes for your questions, comments for Tareq. We have a rolling microphone somewhere. And as a reminder, everything is being recorded. So mind the gap. Who would like to say something? Oh, okay. It's automatic. We don't even need to have a mic. Yes, Lobna.
Yes, hi. I did get the book a couple of days ago, and all I did was open to the dedication because I always do that. And
I do that as well.
Sorry?
I do that as well.
And so I haven't read the book, but just hearing this, the dedication is to both your parents, not just your mother. I mean, maybe that's. But I was also struck by the fact that it was to Mama and Baba, and it was a very kind of personalized thing. I will say I have not read the book, and I don't know your personal life. I just mused about it, whether there was obviously a thanking is dedicated to them, but there was a guilt aspect or some way of, you know, there's a kind of expectation from our parents of, I just, sorry, this completely off the top of my head, but it was just interesting that it was done this way. It was very touching too, because, you know, again, if you're reading a book from a gay man about that life, that it would be dedicated to Mama and Baba was not something I'm used to seeing. So I was touched immediately just by that.
Right.
But also now hearing about these, you know, the role of your mother here and the father. I guess I'm going to ask you about the dedication, though it's your personal, I guess you don't have to be.
No. I'm happy to talk about it. I mean, I had initially wanted actually to dedicate it solely to my mother, because I do think that this book is a book about my mother, not in any way sort of saying my I did not want to include my dad in some kind of dedication, but sort of in a way to commit myself to writing and exploring that relationship more and dedicating a future book to my father. But I sort of it felt more organic for me to do it to both of them in appreciation to how they've moved with me, you know, so much more than I could have ever imagined. The fact that they got to a place where they accept me unconditionally, understand my my life, my queerness, have embraced my relationship. You know, not just my sexuality, also the life choices I made. You know, I'm an engineer by training. Writing a book about Hamas was the most confusing thing to them. And so, you know, growing with me and allowing me space to grow is not something I take for granted. I don't take for granted that both my parents, my father has now passed, but that both of my parents would be able to be in a world where they wouldn't object to this book coming out. That would have been unthinkable, you know, in my teenage years. So I was gratitude to that.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the book, but also the discussion, which was really very interesting and very evocative, and really makes us want to read the book. Kind of, I have a lot of questions, but the one I want to ask is kind of thinking about masculinity in the kind of when a man reaches middle age, it's like midlife crisis. So I know the book is about the past, but how do you, like, kind of writing it and all these questions you had, how does it animate kind of the future, whether personally or politically? And yeah, like, did it feel kind of like moving from maybe like one age to another, or is that something that you were thinking about?
Increasingly, I don't think that I was thinking about it when I was writing this book, but increasingly I am thinking about masculinity in ways that I hadn't before, which is funny to say as a queer man, sort of writing a book about queerness. It really is the case that for me, masculinity felt like something I could never really be accepted into, and so it was a rejection of it. But now I'm very curious about how, you know, the same way that I think about queerness and the abject and Gaza and the abject, I really am thinking about masculinity in political terms, how it animates our lives, our struggle, obviously the authoritarian regimes that I grew up under. And also for me personally, I think I'm curious about, you know, I have this sort of project that I haven't really talked about publicly because it's in very early stages, but I've been really curious about documenting and archiving the lives of queer men in the region, because I'm so interested in this question about how they relate to masculinity, how they sort of view themselves in these spaces, and sort of, and for me, it's encapsulated in my relationship with my father, and his death has sort of, maybe that's what rather than older age, the fact that when he passed away, I think something dislodged in me about, you know, his being the model of what a man should be that I had always aspired to. His passing in some ways makes room for me to come back to that relationship and excavate and explore it in different ways. I'm curious about what comes up. I don't know that I have good or thought out answers to that, only to say that I'm very attracted to it in a way that I hadn't been before.
Thank you. Yes, please, River.
Yes, hi, Tareq. Thank you very much for writing the book, which I look forward to reading. I was wondering, I have also loads of questions, but I was thinking about the last thing you said about Gaza, and as somebody who's also been to Gaza, I completely recognize the effect that it has on anyone who spends any time there, visits there. And I was thinking that perhaps also connecting this to what Ayça said earlier, fire in every direction. So even though you might feel that life can't go on as normal while the genocide is ongoing, and it's absurd to even be sitting in a room talking about anything other than Gaza. At the same time, you are, not having read the book, but from the conversation, you are continuing the struggle, the resistance, the existence in another way, the revolution in another way, right? By producing this and by talking about it and by continuing, by bringing this into the world and into our lives. I was thinking, can you imagine either you or somebody else translating this into Arabic? And second question, if I may, has Ramzi read the book?
So the book is coming out in Arabic. It comes out in Arabic in early 2027.
Excellent.
The question of its distribution in the region is still to be determined, but it will be available in Arabic, which was hugely important for me. Has Ramzi read the book? I have no idea. Because I haven't spoken to Ramzi since 2001, so we're not in contact, and I don't even know if he's aware of the book. Obviously Ramzi isn't his name. Identifying features have been changed. So I don't know, and I think about this in the book as well. I write a bit about it, that he's sort of, for me now, more interesting as a figment of my imagination than a real person. I don't quite care who he is or what he is now. What I care about is what I project onto this sort of fantasy. And that then becomes a thing that I work against. So in some ways, I don't even want to know. I want to sort of leave that unknown. But I have no idea.
Thank you. And yes, please.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
so much. This has been incredible. I kind of want to go back to some of the ideas that Dr. Taha posed about, like the perpetual foreignness and double consciousness, and like Palestinian identity is contested, queer identity is contested, and I'm curious about how this has like shifted for you within the different locations and spaces, from like Amman and Beirut to London. How, if it's reflected in your book, did like those ideas change? Or did you grapple with that while writing it? If I'm making any sense at all.
No, you are. Thank you. Initially on a very superficial level, and I'm almost embarrassed to sort of say it now, but on a very superficial level, about a decade ago when I started thinking about and conceptualizing this book, I had thought, the way that these identities are in conversation is that queerness is policed and demonized back home, and Palestine is policed and demonized here. And that was in many ways sort of part of my thinking about not quite belonging in either space, living in the margins, all of that. And I think the more I wrote through that and the more I thought through it, I came to understand that that binary is very simplistic. And queerness is also obviously policed here, as we see with all of the trans rights and the discourse around trans folks, but not only, and the way that this is criminalized maybe more explicitly in the US than here, but in the Western world generally. And Palestine is policed back home in ways that we don't always talk about, certainly in explicit ways in places like the UAE, but in implicit ways in places like Jordan, where you can, have a watermelon flag or do something humanitarian for Palestine, but you can't agitate for Palestine. You can't be political for Palestine. So those identities, I realized, are explosive identities wherever they are. And this goes back to the point about Gaza and it's sort of a set of objection. What the reason that I was talking about Gaza being sort of the epicenter of our global struggle is because in these identities that are demonized, in these sites that are held in such contempt, it's for a reason. And the reason is that those identities, or in Gaza's case, those sites, are extremely powerful. And they have the power to really revolutionize the way that we think about our lives and our world and how we want to live in it. And so I realized that I was less interested in thinking about it in terms of East, West, all of those sort of geographic formations, and more interested in thinking about why are these identities so frightening to hegemonic powers? What is allowed and isn't allowed to be said? What are we allowed to be talking about? And I was interested specifically, and this is, I think, my Ammani background, interested in the silences. Why are there certain silences? And silences, I don't mean things that we can't talk about, but silences around how things are talked about. In Amman, people talk about Palestine, but how do they talk about Palestine? It's a silencing of Palestine's revolution, Palestine's politics. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in going into these silences and interrogating them as a source of revolution, as a source of disrupting hegemonic systems or systems of domination. And so I think that's ultimately how those identities were in conversation together for me over the course of writing.
Thank you. I'll take two more. One and three. Sorry. Okay, three more. Yes. Maybe we take them together and Tareq can respond in the time that remains. 1, 2, 3, please. Yeah.
Okay, very quickly. So thank you. So I like the production of archive of yourself, right? You refer to that as a Palestinian, or, as a queer man. So how this kind of migration, because you didn't really talk about the word, you talked about exile and, this being in different places and how you articulated the self in different places differently. Doing this kind of work of archiving yourself, your story, was this process cathartic, helpful in some way, or in terms of, I don't know, understanding yourself?
Thank you. Elena?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to read the book. Also because your relationship with your grandmother reminded me of my relationship with my grandmother. So I'm sort of dying to actually read it. But what I found fascinating from the discussion and is this idea that your archive, in my friend Carlos, your archive of yourself or the data of yourself comes alive in a different way, and it's not ossified in the past. So I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit about that relationship of having the freedom to actually alter the archive as well.
Yes.
Yes. I was wondering, if you can maybe talk a little bit about your thoughts on Joseph Mas'ad, and how it connects to, because as queer Arabs and our struggle against imperialism, especially as ones who live in the West, and how our struggles often get instrumentalized for pinkwashing and imperial ends. So we're often put in this weird position where our pain is we're not really in a position to openly talk about our pain back home because it can get appropriated. So writing a queer Arab story, how did you navigate that?
Thank you, everyone. Tareq, your
Yeah.
turn to respond to all three if you can.
So on the question of archives, I want to say two things. One is, so there is an the scholar in me continues to live despite my best efforts. There is an archival core to the text, in the sense that, the prologue that I read, the exchanges that I had with Ramzi meant that I had an archive to go to. I didn't have my side of the letters, I had his side of the letters. And then my grandmother's diaries. And so with both of these bodies of written word, I was able to construct some kind of narrative that might place me in the events that I remember, that might give me some guide to how I would write. And these are events that happened more than 20 years ago. And we all understand memory is unreliable. And so I talk a bit about that at the beginning, the sort of the leaning into the unreliability of memory, and wanting to be honest as I can be to the spirit of what I remember happened, rather than the exact events that happened, because there was no way for me to reconstruct those events, but I could very much reconstruct the emotional footprint of those events and how they landed with me. And so I had archival guardrails, but I tried to sit in that fluidity, the fluidity of memory and the fluidity of sort of trying to work through doing some of that reconstruction. And I don't know if it was cathartic. I mean, this book, I've tried to write this book on and off for years. And as I said at the beginning, to Ayça, there was a sense that actually I couldn't really write until I felt more comfortable in myself and my body. It was too raw for me to sort of sit with, which is something that's strange for me to say, because I'm the kind of writer who understands the world and makes sense of the world through writing. I often don't know what I think until I write what I think. It's sort of through writing that I realize what I want. And with this, it felt different. It felt that actually I needed to come to a place of understanding myself before I could write this book. Having said that, there was, of course, an emotional result. Specifically, I think a healing of relationships with family members, not necessarily with Ramzi, obviously, but with family members, sort of understanding my mother in a different context, her rage, all of those things have had an effect and have changed the way I carry myself in the world at large and in the family in a more specific way. So I do think that it's had that kind of unintended consequence, maybe. In terms of Mas'ad, I mean, I think this is something that I think about a lot. And so I guess also two things to say on this. One is that I am deeply aligned with Mas'ad's argument and his sort of academic work and his intellectual work, but I find it politically dissatisfying because of exactly what you say, which is that it puts queer folk in the region in a very difficult position, whereby if they want to come out and identify in a visible way as queer, or if it's not a choice whether they pass or not, and they don't have the privilege of passing as cis straight folk, the Mas'ad critique puts them in a very difficult position of being essentially foreign agents and so in some ways inadvertently reinforcing the main form of homophobia in the region, which is to say you don't belong here and you're not from here. These are Western imports. So I find that very problematic. You're sort of, and for me, it imprisoned me for the better part of a decade. This sense of feeling like, I can't be openly gay because that would make me a colonized subject. Mm-hmm. So I think the work that the queer movement has been doing to disentangle those things and to say there is a way to demand visibility that is respectful of cultural norms and political realities, and that holds political values that are indigenous. I think demanding that is important. It's a core of the struggle. But I think it's still some, thinking about Sarah Higazi and her experience this is very difficult terrain, this sort of sense that because someone like her raised the rainbow flag, she's asking for that kind of criminalization and torture and ultimately exile. It's a very difficult terrain to be in. So I'm treading very carefully, both in my writing and in my personal life, and trying to think about this ethically and openly, but it's very difficult. The second thing that I wanted to say on this is that I think that there's a way to have this conversation both publicly and privately. And I think that both of these things are important, because we're not in a static world. And I think there's constantly both intrusions into the region is not this sanitized place that exists there is Western incursion into the region, just as the region is also encroaching with its politics and with its whatever cultural values into beyond the region. And I think sort of holding this region as separate, that this place that can be pure and not defiled by colonialism and imperialism is for me just a fantasy. And so having these conversations both within the region and beyond the region, both publicly and privately, is key to sort of getting us to a place where we're grounded in our politics. And this is happening. I do think that it's happening. There's more writing on this, there's more public discussion on this, and there's more activist organizations in these spaces that are raising awareness. And I think that's hopeful for me.
On that hopeful note, thank you very much.
Thank you.